Because it's been a while, I might as well start over. Because I've only read a single chapter. Anyway. Right. So, Book 2 of John le Carré's George Smiley series. A Matter of Quality. Chapter 1. Black Candles. The greatness of Caen School has been ascribed by common consent to Edward VI, whose educational zeal is ascribed by history to the Duke of Somerset. But Caen prefers the respectability of the monarch to the questionable politics of his advisor, drawing strength from the conviction that great schools like Tudor kings were ordained in heaven. And indeed its greatness is a little short of miraculous. Founded by obscure monks, endowed by a sickly boy king, and dragged from oblivion by a Victorian bully, Caen had straightened its collar, scrubbed its rustic hands and face, and presented itself shining to the court of the 20th century. And in the twinkling of an eye, the Dorset bumpkin was London's darling. Dick Whittington had arrived. Caen had parchments in Latin, seals in wax, enormous land behind the abbey. Caen had property, cloisters, and woodworm, a whipping block, and a line in the Doomsday Book. Then what more did it need to instruct the sons of the rich? And they came. Each half they came, for terms are not elegant things, so that throughout a whole afternoon the trains would unload sad groups of black-coated boys onto the station platform. They came in great cars that shone with mournful purity. They came to bury poor King Edward, trundling hand carts over the cobbled streets or carrying tuck boxes like little coffins. Some wore gowns, and when they walked they looked like crows or black angels come for the burying. Some followed singly like undertakers' mutes, and you could hear the clip of their boots as they went. They were always in mourning at Caen, the small boys because they must stay, and the big boys because they must leave. The masters because respectability was underpaid, and now, as the Lent half, as the Easter term was called, drew to its end, the cloud of gloom was as firmly settled as ever the grey towers of Caen. Gloom and cold. The cold was crisp and sharp as flint. It cut the faces of the boys as they moved slowly from the deserted playing fields after the school match. It pierced their black topcoats and turned their stiff pointed collars into icy rings round their necks. Frozen, they plodded from the field to the long walled road which led to the main tuck shop and the town, the line gradually dwindling into groups, and the groups into pairs. Two boys, who looked even colder than the rest, crossed the road and made their way along a narrow path which led towards a distant but less populated tuck shop. I think I shall die if I ever had to watch one of those beastly rugger games again. The noise is fantastic, said one. He was tall with fair hair, and his name was Cayley. People only shout because the Dons are watching from the pavilion, the other rejoined. That's why each house has to stand together, so that the house Dons can swank about how loud their houses shout. What about Rode? Asked Cayley. Why does he stand with us and make a shout then? Here's the house Don, just a bloody usher. He's sucking up to house Dons all the time. You can see him in the quad between lessons buzzing around the big men. All the junior masters do. Cayley's companion was a cynical red-haired boy called Perkins, captain of Fielding's house. I've been to tea with Rode, said Cayley. Rode's hell. He wears brown boots. What was tea like? Bleak. Funny how tea gives them away. Mrs. Rhodes quite decent, though, homely in a pebbly sort of way, doilies and china birds. Food's good. Women's Institute, about good. Rhodes doing core next half, and I put the lid on it. He's so keen, bouncing about all the time. You can tell he's not a gentleman. You know where he went to school? No. Branksome Grammar, Fielding told my mamma when she came over from Singapore last half. God, what's Branksome? On the coast. Near Bournemouth. I haven't been to tea with anyone except Fielding. Perkins added after a slight pause. You get roast chestnuts and crumpets. I'm never allowed to thank him, you know. He says emotionalism is only for the lower classes. That's typical of Fielding. He's not like a Don at all. I think people, boys, bore him. The whole house goes to tea with him once a half. He has us in turn 4 at a time, and that's about the only time he talks to most men. They walked on in silence for a while until Perkins said, Fielding's giving another dinner party tonight. He's pushing the boat out these days, Kayla replies with disapproval. Suppose the food in your house is worse than ever. It's his last harp before he retires. He's entertaining every Don and all the Ys separately by the end of the half. Black candles every evening, for mornings. Hell's extravagant. Yes, I suppose it's a sort of gesture. My pater says he's queer. They crossed the road and disappeared into the tuck shop, where they continued to discuss the weighty affairs of Mr. Terence Fielding, until Perkins drew their meeting reluctantly to a close. Being a poor hand at science, he was unfortunately obliged to take extra tuition in the subject. The dinner party to which Perkins had alluded that afternoon was now drawing to a close. Mr. Terence Fielding, a senior housemaster of Caen, gave himself some more port and pushed the decanter wearily to his left. It was his port, the best he had. There was enough of the best to last the half, and after that, be damned. He felt a little tired after watching the match, a little drunk, and a little bored with the Shane Hecht and her husband. Shane was so hideous, massive and enveloping like a faded Valkyrie. All that black hair. He should have asked someone else. The Snows, for instance. But he was too clever. Or Felix D'Arcy. D'Arcy interrupted. Well, a little later he could annoy Charles Hecht, and Hecht get in a pet and leave early. Hecht was fidgeting, wanting to light his pipe. But Fielding damn well wouldn't have it. Hecht could have a cigar if he wanted to smoke, but his pipe could stay in his dinner jacket pocket where it belonged or didn't belong, and his athletic profile could remain unadorned. Cigar, Hecht? No, thanks, Fielding. I say, do you mind if I can recommend the cigars? Young Haverlake sent them from Havana. His father's ambassador there, you know. Yes, dear, said Shane tolerantly. Vivian Haverlake was in Charles' troop when Charles was commandant of the cadets. Good boy, Haverlake, Hecht observed, and pressed his lips together to show he was a strict judge. It's amusing how things have changed, Shane Hecht said with this rapidly with a rather wooden smile, as if it weren't really amusing. Such a grey world we live in now. I remember before the war, when Charles inspected the corps on a white horse. We don't do that kind of thing now, do we? I got nothing against Mr. Iredale as a commandant, nothing at all. What was his regiment, Terence, do you know? I'm sure he does it very nicely, whatever they do now in the corps. He gets on so well with the boys, doesn't he? His wife's such a nice person. I wonder why they can never keep their servants. I hear Mr. Rhodes will be helping out with the corps next half. Poor little Rhodes, said Fielding slowly, running about like a puppy trying to earn his biscuits. He tries so hard. Have you seen him cheering at school matches? He never seen a game of rugger before he came here, you know. They don't play rugger at grammar schools. It's all soccer. Do you remember when he first came, Charles? It was fascinating. He lay very low at first, drinking us in, the games, the vocabulary, the manners. Then, one day, it was as if he had been given the power of speech, and he spoke in our language. It was amazing, like plastic surgery. It was Felix D'Arcy's work, of course. I'd never seen anything quite like it before. "Dear Mrs. Rhodes," said Shane Hecht in that voice of abstract vagueness which he reserved for a most venomous pronouncement. "So sweet, and such simple taste, don't you think? I mean, whoever would have dreamed of putting those china ducks on the wall? Big ones at the front and the little ones at the back. Charming, don't you think? Like one of those tea shops. I wonder where she bought them. I must ask her. I'm told her father lives near Bournemouth. It must be so lonely for him, don't you think? Such a vulgar place. No one to talk to." Fielding sat back and surveyed his own table. The silver was good. The best in Caen, he had heard it said, and he was inclined to agree. This half he had nothing but black candles. It was the sort of thing people remembered when you'd gone. Dear old Terence, marvellous host. He dined every member of the staff during his last half, wives too. Black candles, rather touching. It broke his heart giving up his house. But he must annoy Charles Hecht. Shane would like that. Shane would egg him on because she hated Charles, because within her great, ugly body, she was as cunning as a snake. Fielding looked at Hecht, and then at Hecht's wife, and she smiled back at him, a slow, rotten smile of a whore. For a moment, Fielding thought of Hecht pasturing in that thick body. It was a scene redolent of Lautrec. Yes, that was it. Charles, pompous and top-hatted, seating stiffly upon the plush coverlet. She, massive, pendulous and bored. The image pleased him. So perverse to consign that fool Hecht from the Spartan cleanliness of Caen to the brothels of 19th century Paris. Fielding began talking, pontificating rather, with an air of friendly objectivity which he knew Hecht would resent. When I look back on my 30 years at Caen, I realize I have achieved rather less than a road sweeper. They were watching him now. I used to regard a road sweeper as a person inferior to myself. Now I rather doubt it. Something is dirty, he makes it clean, and the state of the world is advanced. But what have I done? Entrenched a ruling class which is indistinguished by neither talent, culture, nor wit, kept alive for one more generation the distinctions of a dead age. Charles Hecht, who had never perfected the art of not listening to Fielding, grew red and fussed at the other end of the table. "Don't we teach them, Fielding? What about our successes, our scholarships?" "I have never taught a boy in my life, Charles. Usually the boy wasn't clever enough. Occasionally I wasn't. In most boys, you see, perception dies with puberty. In a few it persists, though where we find it we take good care it can't kill it. If it survives our efforts, the boy wins a scholarship. Bear with me, Shane. It's my last half." "Last half or not, you're talking through your hat, Fielding," said Hecht angrily. "That is traditional at Caen. These successes, as you call them, are the failures, the rare boys who have not learned the lessons of Caen. They ignore the cult of mediocrity. We can do nothing for them, but for the rest of the puzzled little clerics and the blind little soldiers. For them, the truth of Caen is written on the wall, and they hate us." Hecht laughed rather heavily. "Why do so many come back then, if they hate us so much? Why do they remember us and come and see us?" "Because we, dear Charles, are the writing on the wall. The one lesson of Caen they never forget. They come back to read us, don't you see? It was from us that they learned the secret of life. That we grow old, without growing wise. They realized that nothing happened when we grew up. No blinding light on the road to Damascus, no sudden feeling of maturity. Fielding put his head back and gazed at the clumsy Victorian moulding on the ceiling and the halo of dirt round the light rose. We just got a little older. We made the same jokes, thought the same thoughts, wanted the same things. Year in and year out, heck, we were the same people. Not wiser, not better. We haven't had an original thought between us for the last 50 years of our own lives. They saw that. What a trick it all was. Khan and us. Our academic dress, our schoolroom jokes, our wise little offerings of guidance. And that's why they come back year after year of their puzzled, barren lives to gaze fascinated at you and me, act like children at a grave, searching for the secret of life and death. Oh, yes, they have learned that from us. Hecht looked at Fielding in silence for a moment. "Decanter, Hecht," said Fielding, in a slightly conciliatory way, but Hecht's eyes were still upon him. "If that's a joke," he began, and his wife observed with satisfaction that he was very angry indeed. "I wish I knew, Charles," Fielding replied with apparent earnestness. "I really wish I knew. I used to think it was clever to confuse comedy with tragedy. Now I wish I could distinguish them." He rather liked that. They had coffee in the drawing room, where Fielding resorted to gossip, but Hecht was not to be drawn. Fielding rather wished he had let him light his pipe. Then he recalled his vision of the Hects in Paris, and it restored him. It had been rather good this evening. There were moments when he convinced himself. While Shane fetched a coat, the two men stood together in the hall where neither spoke. Shane returned, an ermine stole, yellow with age, draped over her great white shoulders. She inclined her head to the right, smiled, and held out her hand to Fielding, the fingers down. "Terence, darling," she said, as Fielding kissed her fat knuckles. "So kind. And in your last half. You must dine with us before you go. So sad. So few of us left." She smiled again, half closing her eyes to indicate emotional disturbance, then followed her husband into the street. It was still bitterly cold and snow was in the air. Fielding closed and carefully bolted the door behind them, perhaps a fraction earlier than the courtesy required, and returned to the dining room. Hecht's port glass was still about half full. Fielding picked it up and carefully poured the contents back into the decanter. He hoped Hecht wasn't too upset. He hated people to dislike him. He snuffed the black candles and damped their wicks between his forefinger and thumb. Switching on the light, he took from the sideboard a sixpenny notebook and opened it. It contained his list of dining guests for the remainder of the half. With his fountain pen, he placed a neat tick against the name Hecht. They were done. On Wednesday, he would have the roads. The husband was quite good value, but she, of course, was hell. It was not always the way with married couples. The wives, as a rule, were so much more sympathetic. He opened the sideboard and took from it a bottle of brandy and a tumbler. Holding them both in the same hand, he shuffled wearily back into the drawing room, resting his other hand on the wall as he went. God, he felt old, suddenly. That thin line of pain across the chest, that heaviness in the legs and feet. Such an effort being with people, on stage all the time. He hated to be alone. But people bored him. Being alone was like being tired, but unable to sleep. Some German poet had said that. He quoted it once. "You may sleep, but I must dance." Something like that. That's how I am, thought Fielding, That's how Khan is too, an old satire dancing to the music. The music grew faster and their bodies older, but they must dance on. There were young men waiting in the wings. It had been funny once dancing the old dances in the new world. He poured himself some more brandy. He'd be pleased to leave in a way, even though he'd have to go on teaching somewhere else. But it had its beauty, Khan. The abbey close in spring, the flamingo figures of boys waiting for the ritual of worship, the ebb and flow of children like the seasons of the year and the old men dying among them. He wished he could paint. He would paint the pageant of Khan in the fallow browns of autumn. What a shame, thought Fielding, that a mind so perceptive of beauty had no talent for creation. He looked at his watch. 11:45. Nearly time to go out. To dance and not to sleep. 2. The Thursday feeling. It was Thursday evening, and the Christian Voice had just been put to bed. This is scarcely a historic event in Fleet Street. The pimply boy from Dispatch who took away the ragged pile of page proofs showed no more ceremony than was strictly demanded by the eventual prospect of his Christmas bonus. And even in this respect, he had learned that the secular journals of Unipress were more provident of material charity than the Christian Voice, charity being in strict relationship to circulation. Miss Brimley, the journal's editor, adjusted the air cushion beneath her and lit a cigarette. Her secretary and sub-editor, the appointments carried both responsibilities, yawned, dropped the aspirin bottle into a handbag, combed out her ginger hair and bade Miss Brimley good night, leaving behind her a usual smell of strongly scented powder in an empty paper tissue box. Miss Brimley listened contentedly to the clipping echo of her footsteps as it faded down the corridor. It pleased her to be alone at last, tasting the anti-climax. She never failed to wonder at herself, how every Thursday morning brought the same slight uneasiness as she entered the vast Unipress building and stood a little absurdly on one escalator after the other, like a drab parcel on a luxury liner. Heaven knows, she had run the Voice for 14 years, and there were those who said its layout was the best thing Unipress did. Yet, the Thursday feeling never left her. The wakeful anxiety that one day, perhaps today, they wouldn't be ready when the dispatch boy came. She often wondered what would happen then. She had heard of failures elsewhere in that vast combine of features and disapproved and staff rebuked. It was a mystery to her why they kept the Voice at all. An expensive room on the 7th floor and a circulation which, if Miss Brimley knew anything, hardly paid for the paper clips. The Voice had been founded at the turn of the century by old Lord Lansbury, together with a nonconformist daily newspaper and the Temperance Gazette. But the Gazette and the Daily were long since dead. Lansbury's son had woken one morning not so long ago to find his whole business, and every man and woman of it, every stick of furniture, ink, paper clips, and galley pins, bought by the hidden gold of Unipress. That was 3 years ago, and every day she had waited for her dismissal. But it never came. No directive, no question, no word. And so, being a sensible woman, she continued exactly as before, and ceased to wonder. And she was glad. It was easy to sneer at the Voice. Every week it offered humbly and without fanfares evidence of the Lord's intervention in the world's affairs, retold in simple and somewhat unscientific terms the early history of the Jews, and provided over a fictitious signature motherly advice to whomever should write and ask for it. The Voice scarcely concerned itself with the 50-odd millions of the population who had never heard of it. It was a family affair. Rather than abuse those who were not members, it did its best for those who were. For them, It was a kind, optimistic, and informative. If 1 million children were dying of the plague in India, you may be sure that the weekly editorial described the miraculous escape from the fire of a Methodist family in Kent. The voice did not advise you to know how this to disguise the encroaching wrinkles round your eyes, or control your spreading figure. It did not dismay you if you were old by its own eternal youth. It was itself middle-aged and middle-class, counselled caution to girls and charity to all. Nonconformity is the best conservative of habits, and families which took the voice in 1903 continued to take it in 1960. Miss Brimley was not quite the image of her journal. The fortunes of war and the caprice of intelligence work had thrown her into a partnership with the younger Lord Lansbury, and with the 6 years of war they had worked together efficiently and inconspicuously in an unnamed building in Knightsbridge. The fortunes of peace rendered both unemployed, but Lansbury had the good sense, as well as the generosity, to offer Miss Brimley a job. The Voice had ceased publication during the war, and no one seemed anxious to renew it. At first, Miss Brimley had felt a little ashamed at reviving and editing a journal which in no way expressed her own vague deism, but quite soon, as the touching letters came in and the circulation recovered, she developed an affection for her job, and for her readers, which outweighed her earlier misgivings. The Voice was her life, and its readers her preoccupation. She struggled to answer their odd, troubled questions, sought advice of others where she could not provide it herself, and, in time, under a handful of pseudonyms, became, if not their philosopher, their guide, friend, and universal aunt. Miss Brimley put out a cigarette, absently tidied the pins, paper clips, scissors, and paste into the top right-hand drawer of a desk, and gathered together the afternoon mail from her in-tray, which, because it was Thursday, she had left untouched. There were several letters addressed to Barbara Fellowship, under which name the Voice had, since its foundation, answered both privately and through its published columns the many problems of its correspondents. They could wait until tomorrow. She rather enjoyed the problem post, but Friday morning was when she read it. She opened the little filing cabinet at her elbow and dropped the letters into a box file at the front of the compartment. As she did so, one of them fell on its back, and she noticed with surprise that the sealed flap was embossed with an elegant blue dolphin. She picked the envelope out of the cabinet and looked at it curiously, turning it over several times. It was of pale grey paper, very faintly lined. Expensive, perhaps handmade. Beneath the dolphin was a tiny scroll in which she could just discern the legend: Regem defendere diem videre. The postmark was Caen, Dorset. That must be the school crest. But why was Caen familiar to her? Miss Brimley was proud of her memory, which was excellent, and she was vexed when it failed her. As a last resort, she opened the envelope with her faded ivory paper knife and read the letter. Dear Miss Fellowship, I don't know if you're a real person, but it doesn't matter, because you always give such good, kind answers. It was me who wrote last June about the pastry mix. I'm not mad. I know my husband is trying to kill me. Could I please come and see you as soon as it's convenient? I'm sure you'll believe me and understand that I am normal. Could it be as soon as possible, please? I'm so afraid of the long nights. I don't know who else to turn to. I could try Mr. Cardew at the Tabernacle, but he wouldn't believe me, and Dad's too sensible. I might as well be dead. There's something not quite right about him. At night sometimes when he thinks I'm asleep, he just lies watching in the darkness. I know it's wrong to think such wicked things, and I have fear in our hearts, but I can't help it. I hope you don't get many letters like this. Yours faithfully, Stella Road, Mrs. Nee Glaston. She sat quite still at a desk for a moment, looking at the page, at the address in handsome blue engraving at the top of the page. Northfields, Carn School, Dorset. In that moment of shock and astonishment, one phrase forced itself upon her mind. The value of intelligence depends on its breeding. That was John Lansbury's favourite dictum. Until you know the pedigree of the information, you cannot evaluate a report. Yes, that was what he used to say. We are not democratic. We close the door on intelligence without parentage. And she used to reply, Yes, John, but even the best families had to begin somewhere. But Stella Road had parentage. It all came back to her now. She was the Glaston girl, the girl whose marriage was reported in the editorial, the girl who won the summer competition, Samuel Glaston's daughter from Branksome. She had a card in Miss Brimley's index. Abruptly, she stood up, the letter still in her hand, and she walked to the uncurtained window. Just in front of her was a contemporary window box of woven white metal. It was odd, she reflected, how she could never get anything to grow in that window box. She looked down into the street, a slight, sensible figure leaning forward a little and framed by the incandescent fog outside, fog made yellow from the stolen light of London streets. She could just distinguish the street lamps far below, pale and sullen. She suddenly felt the need for fresh air, and on an impulse quite alien to her usual calm, she opened the window wide. The quick, cold, and angry surge of noise burst in on her, and the insidious fog followed. The sound of traffic was constant, so that for a moment she thought it was the turning of some great machine. Then, above its steady growl, she heard the newsboys. Their cries were like the cries of gulls against the gathering storm. She could see them now, sentinels among the hastening shadows. It might be true. That had always been the difficulty. Right through the war, it was the same restless search. It might be true. It was no use relating reports to probability when there was no quantum of knowledge from which to start. She remembered the first intelligence from France to flying bombs, wild talk of concrete runways in the depths of a forest. You had to resist the dramatic, you had to hold out against it. Yet, it might be true. Tomorrow, the day after, those newsboys down there might be shouting it, and Stella Road, Nee Glaston might be dead. And if that was so, if there was the remotest chance that this man was plotting to kill this woman, then she, Ailsa Brimley, must do what she could to prevent it. Besides, Stella Glaston had to claim on her insistence if anyone did. Both her father and her grandfather had taken the voice, and when Stella married 5 years ago, Miss Brimley had put a couple of lines about it in the editorial. The Glastons sent her a Christmas card every year. They were one of those the original families to subscribe. It was cold at the window, but she remained there, still fascinated by the half-hidden shadows joining and parting beneath her, and the useless street lights burning painfully among them. She began to imagine him as one of those shadows, pressing and jostling, his murderer's eyes turned to sockets of dark. And suddenly, she was frightened and needed help. But not the police. Not yet. If Stella Road had wanted that, she would have gone herself. Why hadn't she? For love? For fear of looking a fool? Because instinct was not evidence? They wanted fact. But the fact of murder was death. Must they wait for that? Who would help? She thought at once of Lansbury, but he was farming in Rhodesia. Who else had been with them in the war? Fielding and Jebediah were dead. Steed Asprey vanished. Smiley? Where was he? George Smiley, the cleverest and perhaps the oddest of them all. Of course, Miss Brimley remembered now. He made that improbable marriage and went back to research at Oxford. But he hadn't stayed there. The marriage had broken up. What had he done after that? She returned to her desk and picked up the S through Z directory. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in a taxi, heading for Sloane Square. In a neatly gloved hand, she held a cardboard folder containing Stella Rhodes' card from the index and the correspondence which had passed between them at the time of the summer competition. She was nearly at Piccadilly when she remembered she'd left the office window open. It didn't seem to matter much. With other people, it's Persian cats or golf. With me, it's The Voice and my readers. I'm a ridiculous spinster, I know, but there it is. I won't go to the police until I've tried something, George. And you thought you'd try me? Yes. She was sitting in the study of George Smiley's house in Bywater Street. The only light came from the complicated lamp on his desk, a black spider of a thing shining brightly onto the manuscript notes which covered the desk. So you've left the service? She said. Yes, I have. He nodded, his round head vigorously, as if reassuring himself that a distasteful experience was really over, and mixed Miss Brimley a whisky and soda. I had another spell thereafter. Oxford. It's all very different in peacetime, you know, he continued. Miss Brimley nodded. I can imagine it. More time to be bitchy. Smiley said nothing, just lit a cigarette and sat down opposite her. And the people have changed. Fielding, Steed, Jebediah, all gone. She said this in a matter-of-fact way as she took from her large, sensible handbag Stella Rhodes' letter. This is the letter, George. When he had read it, he held this briefly towards the lamp, his round face caught by the light in a moment of almost comic earnestness. Watching him, Miss Brimley wondered what impression he made on those who did not know him well. She used to think of him as the most forgettable man she had ever met. Short and plump, with heavy spectacles and thinning hair. He was at first sight the very prototype of an unsuccessful middle-aged bachelor in a sedentary occupation. His natural diffidence in most practical matters was reflected in his clothes, which were costly and unsuitable, for he was clay in the hands of his tailor, who robbed him. He had put down the letter on the small marquetry table beside him, and was looking at her owlishly. This other letter she sent you, Brim. Where is it? She handed him the folder. He opened it and after a moment read aloud Rhodes' other letter. Dear Miss Fellowship, I would like to submit the following suggestion for your kitchen hints competition. Make your basic batch of cake mixture once a month. Cream equal quantities of fat and sugar and add 1 egg for every 6 ounces of the mixture. For puddings and cakes, add flour to the required quantity of basic mixture. This will keep well for a month. I enclose stamped addressed envelope. Yours sincerely, Stella Rhodes, New Glaston. P.S. Incidentally, you can prevent wire wool from rusting by keeping it in a jar of soapy water. Are we allowed 2 suggestions? If so, please can this be my second? She won the competition, Miss Brimley observed. But that's not the point. This is what I want to tell you, George. She's a Glaston, and the Glastons have been reading The Voice since it started. Stella's grandfather was old Rufus Glaston, a Lancashire pottery king. He and John Lansbury's father built chapels and tabernacles in practically every village in the Midlands. When Rufus died, the Voice put out a memorial edition, and old Lansbury himself wrote the obituary. Samuel Glaston took on his father's business, but had to move south because of his health. He ended up near Bournemouth, a widower with one daughter, Stella. She was the last of all that family. The whole lot are as down to earth as you could wish, Stella included, I should think. I don't think any of them is likely to be suffering from delusions of persecution. Smiley was looking at her in astonishment. My dear Brim, I can't possibly take that in. How on earth do you know all this? Miss Brimley smiled apologetically. The Glastons are easy. They're almost part of the magazine. They send us Christmas cards and boxes of chocolates on the anniversary of our foundation. We've got about 500 families who form what I call our establishment. They're in on the Voice from the start, and they kept up ever since. They write to us, George. If they're worried, they write and say so. If they're getting married, moving house, retiring from work, if they're ill, depressed or angry, they write. Not often, heaven knows, but enough. How do you remember it all? I don't. I keep a card index. I always write back, you see. Only, yes. Miss Brimley looked at him earnestly. This is the first time anyone has written because she's frightened. What do you want me to do? I've only had one bright idea so far. I seem to remember Adrian Fielding had a brother who taught at Caen. He's a housemaster there, if he hasn't retired. No, he retires this half. It was in the Times some weeks ago, in that little bit on the court page where Caen always announces itself. It said, Caen School reassembles today for the Lent half. Mr. T.R. Fielding will retire at the end of the half, having completed his statutory 15 years as a housemaster. Smiley laughed. Really, Brim, your memory's absurd. It was the mention of Fielding. Anyway, I thought you could bring him up, you know. You must know him. Yes, I know him. At least I met him once at Magdalen High Table. But... Smiley coloured a little. But what, George? Well, he's not quite the man his brother was, you know. How could he be? Miss Brimley rejoined a little sharply. But he can tell you something about Cellar Road, and the husband. I don't think I could do that on the telephone. I think I'd rather go and see him. But what's to stop you ringing up Stella Road? Well, I can't tonight, can I? Her husband will be in. I thought I'd put a letter in the post to her tonight telling her she can come to see me at any time. But, she continued, making a slight impatient movement with her foot, I want to do something now, George. Smiley nodded and went to the telephone. He rang directory inquiries and asked for Terence Fielding's number. After a long delay, he was told to ring Caen School Central Exchange, who would connect him with whomever he required. Miss Brimley, watching him, wished she knew a little more about George Smiley. How much of that diffidence was assumed, how vulnerable he was. The best, Adrian had said, the strongest and the best. But so many men learnt strength during the war, learnt terrible things, and put aside their knowledge with a shudder when it ended. The number was ringing now. She heard the dialing tone and for a moment was filled with apprehension. For the first time, she was afraid of making a fool of herself, afraid of becoming involved in unlikely explanations with angular and suspicious people. Mr. Terence Fielding, please. A pause. Fielding, good evening. My name is George Smiley. I knew your brother well in the war. We have, in fact, met. Yes, quite right. Magdalen, was it not, summer before last? Look, I wonder if I might come and see you on a personal matter. It's a little difficult to discuss on the telephone. A friend of mine has received a rather disturbing letter from the wife of a Khan master. Oh, well, Road. Stella Road? Her husband. He suddenly stiffened, and Miss Brimley, her eyes fixed upon him, saw with alarm how his chubby face broke into an expression of pain and disgust. She no longer heard what he was saying. She could only watch the dreadful transformation of his face, the whitening knuckles of his hand clutching the receiver. He was looking at her now, saying something. It was too late. Stella Road was dead. She had been murdered late on Wednesday night. They'd actually been dining with Fielding the night it happened. "3. The night of the murder. The 7.5 from Waterloo to Yeovil is not a popular train, though it provides an excellent breakfast. Smiley had no difficulty in finding a first-class compartment to himself. It was a bitterly cold day, dark and the sky heavy with snow. He sat, huddled in a voluminous travelling coat of continental origin, holding in its gloved hands a bundle of the day's papers. Because he was a precise man, he did not care to be hurried, and he had arrived 30 minutes before the train was due to depart. Still tired after the stresses of the previous night, when he had sat up talking with Ailsa Brimley until heaven knew what hour, he was disinclined to read. Looking out of the window onto an almost empty station, he caught sight, to his great surprise, of Miss Brimley making her way along the platform, peering in the windows, a carrier bag in her hand. He lowered the window and called to her. "My dear Brim, what are you doing at this dreadful hour? You should be in bed." She sat down opposite him and began unpacking her bag and handing him its contents: thermos, sandwiches, and chocolate. I didn't know whether there was a breakfast car," she explained. "And besides, I wanted to come and see you off. You're such a dear, George, and I wish I could come with you, but you and Press would go mad if I did. The only time they notice is when you're not there." "Haven't you seen the papers?" he asked. "Just briefly, on the way here. They seem to think it wasn't him, but some madman." "I know, Brim. That's what Fielding said, wasn't it?" There was a moment's awkward silence. "George, am I being an awful arse letting go off like this? I was sure last night, but now I wonder." "After you left, I rang Ben Sparrow of Special Branch. You remember him, don't you? He was with us in the war. I told him the whole story." "George! At 3 a.m? "Yes. He's ringing the divisional superintendent at Khan. He'll tell him about the letter and then that I'm coming down. Ben had an idea that the man named Rigby would be handling the case. Rigby and Ben were at police college together." He looked at her kindly for a moment. "Besides, I'm a man of leisure, Brim. I shall enjoy the change." "Bless you, George," said Miss Brimley, woman enough to believe him. She got up to go, and Smiley said to her, "Brim, if you should need any more help or anything, and can't get a hold of me, there's a man called Mendel who lives in Mitcham, a retired police inspector. He's in the book. If you get a hold of him and mention me, he'll do what he can for you. I booked a room at the Sawley Arms." Alone again, Smiley surveyed uneasily the assortment of food and drink which Miss Brimley had provided. He had promised himself the luxury of breakfast in the restaurant car. He would keep the sandwiches and the coffee for later. That would be the best thing. For lunch, perhaps. And he would breakfast properly. In the restaurant car, Smiley read first the less sensational reports on the death of Stella Road. It appears that on Wednesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Road had been guests at dinner of Mr. Terence Fielding, the senior housemaster at Caen and brother of the late Adrian Fielding, the celebrated French scholar who had vanished during the war while specially employed by the War Office. They had left Mr. Fielding's house together at about 10 to 11 and walked the half-mile from the centre of the Caen to their house, which stood alone at the edge of the famous Caen playing field. As they reached their house, Mr. Rowe remembers that he had left at Mr. Fielding's house some examination papers, which urgently required correction that night. At this point, Smiley remembers that he had failed to pack his dinner jacket, and that Fielding would almost certainly ask him to dine. Rowe determined to walk back to Fielding's house and collect the papers, therefore, starting back at about 11:05. It appears that Mrs. Road made herself a cup of tea and sat down in the drawing room to await his return. Adjoining the back of the house is a conservatory, the inner door of which leads to the drawing room. It was there that Road eventually found his wife when he returned. There were signs of a struggle, and certain inexpensive articles of jewellery were missing from the body. The confusion in the conservatory was terrible. Fortunately, there had been a fresh fall of snow on Wednesday afternoon, and detectives from Dorchester were examining the footprints and other traces earlier on Thursday morning. Mr. Road had been treated for shock at Dorchester Central Hospital. The police wished to interview a woman from the adjacent village of Pyle, who was locally known as Mad Janie on account of her eccentric and solitary habits. Mrs. Road, who was well known in Caen for her energetic work on behalf of the International Refugee Year, had apparently shown a charitable interest in her welfare, and she had vanished without a trace since the night of the murder. The police were currently of the opinion that the murderer had caught sight of Mrs. Road through the drawing-room window. She had not drawn the curtains, and that Mrs. Road had admitted the murderer at the front door in the belief that it was her husband returning from Mr. Fielding's house. The Home Office pathologist had asked to conduct a post-mortem examination. The other reports were not so restrained. Murder most foul has desecrated the hallowed playing fields of Caen, one article began, and another, science teacher discovers murdered wife in blood-spattered conservatory. A third screamed, mad woman sought in Caen murder. With an expression of distaste, Smiley screwed up all the newspapers except The Guardian and The Times and tossed them onto the luggage rack. He changed the Yeovil for a local line to Sturminster, Oakford and Caen. It was something after 11 o'clock when he finally arrived at Caen station. He telephoned the hotel from the station and went and sent his luggage ahead by taxi. The Sawley Arms was only full at Commemoration and on St. Andrew's Day. Most of the year it was empty, sitting like a prim Victorian lady at slate roof in the mauve of half-morning, on the ill-tended lawns midway between the station and Caen Abbey. Snow still lay on the ground, but the day was fine and dry, and Smiley decided to walk into the town and arrange to meet the police officer conducting the investigation of the murder. He left the station, with its foretaste of Victorian austerity, and walked along the avenue of bare trees which led towards the great Abbey Tower, flat and black against the colourless winter sky. He crossed the Abbey Close, a serene and beautiful square of medieval houses, the roofs snow-covered, the white lawns shaded with pin-strokes of grass. As he passed the west door of the abbey, the soft snow creaking where he trod, the clock high above him struck the half-hour, and 2 knights on horseback rode out from their little castle over the door, and slowly raised their lances to each other in salute. Then, as if it were all part of the same clockwork mechanism, other doors all round the close opened too, releasing swarms of black-coated boys who stampeded across the snow towards the abbey. One boy passed so close that his gown brushed against Smiley's sleeve. Smiley called to him as he ran past. "What's going on?" "Sext!" shouted the boy in reply, and was gone. He passed the main entrance of the school and came at once upon the municipal part of the town, a lugubrious 19th century fairyland in local stone, stitched together by a complexity of Gothic chimneys and crenelled windows. Here was the town hall, and beside it was the flag of St. George floating at its masthead, the constabulary headquarters, built 90 years ago to withstand the onslaughts of archery and battering rams. He gave his name to the duty sergeant and asked to see the officer investigating the death of Mrs. Rhodes. The sergeant, an elderly, inscrutable man, addressed himself to the telephone with a certain formality, as if he were about to perform a difficult conjuring trick. To Smiley's surprise, he was told that Inspector Rigby would be pleased to see him at once, and a police cadet was summoned to show him the way. He was led at a spanking pace up the wide staircase in the centre of the hall, and in a matter of moments found himself before the inspector. He was a very short man, and very broad. He could have been a scout from the tin mines of Cornwall or the collieries of Wales. His dark grey hair was cut very close. It came to a point in the centre of his brow like a devil's cap. His hands were large and powerful. He had the trunk and stance of a wrestler, but he spoke slowly, with a Dorset burr to his soft voice. Smiley quickly noticed that he had one quality rare among small men, the quality of openness. Through his eyes were dark and bright, and the movements, though his eyes were dark and bright, and the movements of his body swift, he imparted a feeling of honesty and straight dealing. "Ben Sparrow rang me this morning, sir. I'm very pleased you've come. I believe you got a letter for me?" Rigby looked at Smiley thoughtfully over his desk and decided that he liked what he saw. He had got round in the war and had heard a little, just a very little, of the work of George Smiley's service. If Ben said Smiley was all right, that was good enough for him. Or almost. But Ben had said more than that. "Looks like a frog, dresses like a bookie, and has a brain I'd give my eyes for. And a very nasty war, very nasty indeed." Well, he looked like a frog, right enough. Short and stubby, round spectacles and thick lenses that made his eyes bulge. His clothes were odd. Expensive, mind, you could see that. But his jacket seemed to drape where there wasn't any room for drape. What did surprise Rigby was his shyness. Rigby had expected someone a little brash, a little too smooth for Khan, whereas Smiley had an earnest formality of manner which appealed to Rigby's conservative taste. Smiley took the letter from his wallet and put it on the desk, while Rigby extracted an old pair of gold-rimmed spectacles from a battered metal case and adjusted the edges carefully over his ears. "I don't know if Ben explained," said Smiley, But this letter was sent to the correspondence section of a small, nonconformist journal to which Mrs. Rhodes subscribed. And Miss Fellowship is the lady who brought you to the letter? No. Her name is Brimley. She is the editor of the magazine. Fellowship is just a pen name for the correspondence column. The brown eyes rested on him for a moment. When did she receive this letter? Yesterday, the 17th. Thursday's the day they go to press, their busy day. The afternoon mail doesn't get opened until the evening, usually. This was opened about 6 o'clock, I suppose. And she brought it straight to you? Yes. Why? She worked for me during the war, in my department. She was reluctant to go straight to the police. I was the only person she could think of who wasn't a policeman. He added stupidly. Who could help, I mean. May I ask what you yourself, sir, do for a living? Nothing much. A little private research on 17th century Germany. It seemed a very silly answer. Rigby didn't seem bothered. What's this earlier letter she talks about? Smiley offered him the second envelope, and again, the big square hand received it. It appears she won this competition, Smiley explained. That was her winning entry. I gather she comes from a family which has subscribed to the magazine since its foundation, that's why Miss Brimley was less inclined to regard the letter as nonsense. Not that it follows. Not that what follows? I meant that the fact that her family had subscribed to a journal for 50 years does not logically affect the possibility that she was unbalanced. Rigby nodded, as if he saw the point. But Smiley had an uncomfortable feeling that he did not. Ah, said Rigby with a slow smile. Women, eh? Smiley, completely bewildered, gave a little laugh. Rigby was looking at him thoughtfully. Do any of the staff know you, sir? Only Mr. Terence Fielding. We met at the Oxford dinner some time ago. I thought I'd call round and see him. I knew his brother pretty well. Rigby appeared to stiffen slightly at the mention of Fielding, but he said nothing, and Smiley went on. It was Fielding I rang when Miss Brimley brought to me the letter. He told me the news. That was last night. I see. They looked at one another again in silence. Smiley discomfited and slightly comic. Rigby appraising him, wondering how much to say. How long are you staying? He said at last. I don't know, Smiley replied. Miss Brimley wanted to come herself, but she has a paper to run. She attached great importance, you see, to doing all she could for Mrs. Rhodes, even though she was dead. Because she was a subscriber, I mean. I promised to see that the letter arrived quickly in the right hands. I don't imagine there's much else I can do. I shall probably stay on for a day or two just to have a word with Fielding. Go to the funeral, I suppose. I've looked in at the Sawley Arms. Fine hotel, that. Rigby put his spectacles carefully back into their case and dropped the case into a drawer. Funny place, Khan. There's a big gap between the town and gown, as we say. Neither side knows nor likes the other. It's fear that does it, fear and ignorance. It makes it hard in a case like this. Oh, I can call on Mr. Fielding and Mr. D'Arcy, and they say, "Good day, Sergeant," to give me a cup of tea in the kitchen, but I can't get among them. They've got their own community, see, and no one outside can get in. No gossip in the pubs, no contacts, nothing. Just cups of tea and biscuits and sea cake and being called Sergeant. Rigby laughed suddenly, and Smiley laughed with him in relief. There's a lot I'd like to ask them. A lot of things. Who liked the Rhodes and who didn't. Whether Mr. Rhodes a good teacher and whether his wife fitted in with the others. I've got all the facts I want, but I've got no clothes to hang them on. He looked at Smiley expectantly. There was a very long silence. If you want me to help, I'd be delighted, said Smiley, at last. But give me the facts first.